December 26, 1943. Cape Gloucester, New Britain. A young Marine wades through chest-deep swamp water. The jungle canopy overhead is so dense that one Marine historian later described the conditions as perpetual twilight. Even at noon, the rainforest floor sits in near darkness, vines thick as a man's arm hanging between trees rising 100 to 150 feet overhead. Ground observation extends at best about 50 feet in any direction. Then, somewhere ahead, a single rifle crack. The man beside him drops. No muzzle flash, no second shot, not for hours. No shape to fire back at, no position to charge. The shooter could be 10 yards away or 200, in front of him or behind him or directly overhead, camouflaged in palm fronds or dug into a spider hole wedged between tree roots. And here is the detail that made this specific threat different from anything Allied troops had faced in any previous theater of the war. Every briefing had hammered home that the man who fired that shot was not shooting at random. He was aiming for someone specific. The officer, the radio operator, the corpsman, the handful of men who actually held a Marine platoon together under pressure. This was the Japanese sniper problem, and no Allied army that encountered it in 1942 had a working answer for it. British forces lost forward observers across Burma and New Guinea to single-shot kills they could never trace back to a source. American soldiers spent the war's first 18 months in the Pacific learning, one death at a time, that nearly everything the U.S. Army had taught about counter-sniper doctrine in Europe simply did not transfer to a Pacific jungle. Australian and Dutch colonial forces fared no better. Every Allied army that fought the Imperial Japanese Army on island terrain independently arrived at the identical, unwelcome conclusion. The single most dangerous thing on these islands was not a formation, a fortification, or a piece of armor. It was one man with a rifle nobody could see, positioned somewhere nobody could predict, who somehow always seemed to kill precisely the man a platoon most needed to keep alive. The United States Marine Corps did eventually solve this problem. Not with one weapon, one tactic, or one moment of insight, but through 3 grinding years of trial, error, and a body count nobody involved would later describe as acceptable. By the war's final battles, Marine Scout sniper platoons were doing something that would have sounded like fiction to the men wading through that Cape Gloucester swamp, locating Japanese snipers inside their own concealed positions and killing them before those snipers ever fired a shot. Operating for days behind enemy lines on islands where a single gunshot could mean instant death, turning the most feared individual killer of the entire Pacific War into a hunted man. In 1942, a Marine rifleman's odds of surviving a jungle patrol depended largely on chance, whether the man walking point happened to notice a disturbed leaf, whether an officer happened to duck at the right moment. By 1945, that same calculation had become something closer to an engineering problem, worked out through specific rifles, specific team structures, and a specific sequence of supporting weapons applied in a specific order. Nobody planned it in advance. It was assembled, battle by costly battle, by men whose names mostly do not survive in any popular account of the war. To understand how that transformation actually happened, the account has to start with the specific rifle that made the Japanese sniper so difficult to detect in the first place, and with a training gap so severe that veterans of the Western Front in the First World War frequently refused to believe what their own men were telling them about conditions in the Pacific. The problem begins with a specific rifle, the Type 97 Arisaka. Handle one today and it does not immediately impress. A bolt-action design with a modest 2.5 power scope, chambered for a 6.5mm cartridge that Western ballistics experts of the period generally considered underpowered compared to the American .30-06 or the British .303. By most conventional performance metrics, the Type 97 came up short against contemporary Allied sniper rifles. So why did it terrify an entire generation of Allied infantrymen? Because of one specific design decision almost no other military of the period made. Japanese ordnance officers developed a reduced-charge 6.5mm cartridge specifically for use in the Type 97, marked on its packaging with a small circled character identifying it as the low-powder variant. Combined with the rifle's unusually long barrel, the reduced propellant charge produced almost no visible muzzle flash and almost no smoke, a round engineered, quite deliberately, to make the act of sniping itself invisible to the men receiving fire. A period assessment published in the Marine Corps Gazette summarized the resulting tactical problem in language that reads, in retrospect, close to a confession. American troops found it very difficult to detect the enemy through the smoke and muzzle flame of the fire, the report noted, except, against the Type 97, there typically was no smoke and no flame to detect in the first place. Just a crack and a dead man. The specific irony worth pausing on is that the Type 97's underlying rifle mechanism was, by 1943, already considered somewhat dated by Japanese ordnance planners themselves. Its genuine lethality traced almost entirely to the ammunition paired with it and the discipline of the men firing it, rather than to any innovation in the weapon's basic mechanical design. Now add the soldier actually behind the rifle. Japanese snipers of this period were not simply assigned the role. They were selected, in the most literal sense, by instructors who handpicked the finest natural marksmen from entire training cohorts, frequently men who had grown up hunting in rural Japan, Korea, or Manchuria, and ran them through a specialized course built around a single organizing virtue: patience. The ability to hold a single concealed position, without moving, for hours or even days at a stretch, was treated as considerably more valuable to the Imperial Japanese Army than raw shooting talent alone. The doctrine built around this selection process was equally distinctive. A Japanese sniper did not hunt for the longest possible shot the way many Western snipers were trained to. Dense undergrowth and short sight lines across most Pacific terrain made genuine long-range shooting close to impossible regardless. So Japanese snipers instead positioned themselves with unsettling proximity to expected American lines of advance. One British wartime analysis of Japanese methods described sniper posts sited above small forward positions, covering approach lines and even, in several documented instances, covering gaps deliberately left in American field telephone cable runs to catch repair crews. The specific tactic that left the deepest psychological mark on Pacific veterans, though, was something else entirely. American combat records from the theater describe it plainly. A favored Japanese technique was to let an entire patrol pass directly by a camouflage position undetected, and only then open fire, shooting Americans in the back. Consider what that actually meant for the man walking point on a jungle trail. Every instinct and every hour of training told him danger sat somewhere ahead, in the direction he was actively watching. The Japanese sniper, concealed in a position the Japanese themselves called a takotsubo, literally an octopus pot, let that entire patrol walk past within arm's reach of his hide, then shot the captain in the back of the skull. By the time the surviving squad turned to locate the direction of fire, the sniper might already have killed 4 or 5 men from the same static position, slipping away through a connecting trench to a second prepared hide before the survivors could organize any coordinated response at all. The targets were never random. Japanese sniper doctrine specifically prioritized officers, machine gunners, artillery forward observers, and radio operators. Anyone carrying binoculars or a map case. Anyone wearing visible rank insignia. Anyone whose bearing marked him as the man actually holding a platoon together. The 1st Battalion, 163rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, fighting in New Guinea, recorded in its own divisional history that a Japanese sharpshooter positioned almost anywhere around a perimeter could select and engage any American who was simply forced to leave his foxhole for any reason at all. A man could not relieve himself without exposure, could not stand to stretch cramped muscles, could not shout a routine order without becoming a target of opportunity. And the most psychologically unsettling detail Marines came to understand only gradually was this: the men shooting at them frequently had no intention of surviving the engagement at all. Documented, if less common than wartime rumor suggested, were cases of Japanese snipers physically tied or strapped into their firing position in trees, specifically so that even a fatal wound would not cause the body to fall and reveal the hide's location. In the broader sense, every Japanese sniper post functioned as something close to a deliberate suicide position. The doctrine behind it was never engage and withdraw. It was to inflict the maximum possible number of casualties before being located and killed. This was the man waiting somewhere in the swamp at Cape Gloucester. A single invisible shot capable of collapsing a platoon's entire leadership structure in the space of 3 seconds. You could not outshoot this specific threat at his own game inside his own jungle. The only remaining option was to outthink him, and doing that, it turned out, required building an entirely different kind of soldier than the United States military had, up to that point, ever seriously attempted to produce. In the spring of 1942, as the 1st Marine Division prepared for its first major amphibious operation since the First World War, the United States Army possessed no official sniper training program whatsoever. Let that sit for a moment. The largest army on the planet, about to commit millions of men to combat across 2 separate oceans, had not formally trained a single dedicated sniper. Official Army documentation from the period confirms this bluntly. While an advanced marksmanship course existed at Camp Perry, Ohio, the Army fielded no formal sniper school throughout the entire war. Individual unit commanders could, at their own initiative, organize ad hoc instruction. One infantry regiment commander in Tunisia reportedly ran a brief 5-week course that produced a small handful of trained marksmen. But where a given commander lacked the interest or the time, nothing comparable happened at all. The specific institutional weakness this produced, as later wartime analysis put it, was a persistent gap between marksmanship, which American training generally handled to a genuinely high standard, and fieldcraft, the broader skill of concealment, stalking, and sustained observation, which remained comparatively underdeveloped. American soldiers, in short, could shoot extremely well. What they generally could not yet do was hide, stalk, observe, and remain functionally invisible for days at a stretch. They were marksmen. They were not, in the specific professional sense the Pacific War demanded, snipers. The Marine Corps was somewhat further along, though only somewhat. A small, informal scout sniper school operated at Camp Elliott in San Diego beginning in 1941, training a limited number of enlisted Marines until a more formal program replaced it in December 1942. That earlier informal effort produced a handful of capable men, few trained comprehensively in the field skills that would ultimately matter most. One of those men was William Dean Hawkins, and the story of how the Marine Corps eventually solved the Japanese sniper problem runs directly through what happened to him. Hawkins was not, on paper, an obvious candidate to lead an elite platoon into some of the war's most dangerous fighting. Born in 1914 in Fort Scott, Kansas, he carried permanent scarring from a childhood accident. A neighbor had accidentally spilled scalding water on him as an infant, damage severe enough that his own mother spent close to a year massaging his injured muscles before he could walk normally. After Pearl Harbor, both the Army and the Navy Air Corps rejected his enlistment specifically because of those scars. The Marine Corps accepted him. He deployed as a private first class in June 1942, fought on Guadalcanal, earned a battlefield commission to second lieutenant, and was given command of the Scout Sniper Platoon attached to the 2nd Marine Regiment. The mere fact that the Marine Corps maintained a dedicated Scout Sniper Platoon structure at all in 1942 was itself unusual. Most other Western armies of the period considered such a standing unit either redundant or simply unnecessary. Marine planners, having studied their own First World War after-action reports more carefully than most of their contemporaries, kept the organizational structure alive on paper. But an organizational chart is not the same thing as institutional competence, and in 1942, these platoons remained genuinely undertrained, under-equipped, and functionally untested in actual combat conditions. What existed was a frame. Filling that frame out with anything resembling a working doctrine would take men like Hawkins roughly 18 more months, paid for largely in blood and improvisation rather than formal instruction. Marine forces won at Guadalcanal, at Bougainville, and at Cape Gloucester across this period. But every after-action report from these victories carried the identical recurring complaint: casualties to snipers, officers lost, patrols stalled, forward observers killed before they could relay a single useful report. Lieutenant Colonel John B. George, an officer serving with the U.S. Army's 132nd Infantry Regiment on Guadalcanal from late 1942, would go on to write what many historians consider the definitive frontline account of small arms combat in the early Pacific War, his 1947 book, Shots Fired in Anger. George, a competitive shooter before the war, had effectively appointed himself an unofficial sniper, hunting Japanese marksmen with whatever suitable rifle he could locate. His verdict on the standard American sniper rifle of the period, the M1903A4 fitted with a 2.5 power Weaver scope, was blunt. The rifle placed, in his own words, a delicate and optically inadequate weapon of only moderate accuracy into the hands of troops who had received essentially no training in its specific use. The scope fogged reliably in tropical humidity, and because the rifle carried no functional iron sights as backup, a fogged scope rendered the entire weapon effectively useless in the field. The Marine alternative, the M1903A1 fitted with an 8-power uninertal scope, performed superbly on paper, grouping shots inside an inch and a half at 600 yards under match conditions. In actual jungle deployment, the same long scope fogged just as reliably in humid conditions, lost its zero repeatedly, and proved so physically awkward in genuine close-range combat that an after-action report from the 1st Marine Raiders on New Georgia specifically recommended replacing it outright. By mid-1943, the picture facing American forces was genuinely bleak. 2 available sniper rifles, neither well suited to actual jungle conditions, an army with no organized sniper training pipeline whatsoever, a Marine Corps running a handful of informal schools and experimental platoons, and a Japanese opponent fielding a rifle purpose-engineered for jungle ambush, soldiers trained across years in patience and concealment, and a doctrine that converted every ordinary patrol trail into a potential killing ground. Then came Tarawa. November 20th, 1943. The Battle of Tarawa, fought across the tiny coral island of Beccio in the Gilbert Islands, became the bloodiest 76 hours of Marine Corps history to that point. Close to 6,000 men killed across an area smaller than the Pentagon's own grounds and parking lots combined. The first Marines to actually set foot on Beccio were not drawn from a conventional line infantry company. They were the 34 men of the Scout Sniper Platoon, 2nd Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division, commanded by 1st Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins. Their assigned mission bordered on suicidal by any reasonable tactical assessment. The Beccio Pier extended roughly 500 yards into the surrounding lagoon, and Japanese gunners had built emplacements directly into its structure, positions that, left uncleared before the main landing waves arrived, would have shredded the approaching Amtraks at essentially point-blank range. Hawkins's platoon was ordered to clear that pier alone, 15 minutes ahead of any other Marine touching the beach. What followed became one of the documented set-piece actions of Marine Corps history. According to Hawkins's own Medal of Honor citation, he and his platoon assaulted the pier emplacements directly with grenades and demolition charges. Hawkins himself was hit by shrapnel during the assault and refused evacuation outright. The following morning, with the main landing force now ashore but pinned down under fire from a cluster of pillboxes, Hawkins personally led an assault against a position fortified by 5 separate Japanese machine guns, crawling forward under sustained fire and firing directly into the gun loopholes at point-blank range. He was shot through the chest. He again refused evacuation, reportedly telling the men around him that he had come to kill Japanese soldiers, not to be evacuated. He went on to personally destroy 3 additional pillboxes before finally being caught in a burst of Japanese shellfire and mortally wounded. When Tarawa was declared secure, Colonel David M. Shoup, who would later become Commandant of the entire Marine Corps, offered an assessment preserved in the battle's official monograph. It was not often, Shoup observed, that a first lieutenant could genuinely be credited with winning a battle, but Hawkins came as close to that distinction as any man reasonably could. The captured airstrip on Beccio was subsequently named Hawkins Field in his honor, but Tarawa raised an uncomfortable institutional question that mattered considerably more to the Marine Corps going forward than Hawkins's individual heroism alone. Why was the Corps' first dedicated Scout Sniper Platoon performing straightforward infantry assault work at all, rather than the scouting and sniping duties its own designation implied? The honest answer, in late 1943, was that the Marine Corps itself still had not fully worked out what a Scout Sniper Platoon was actually supposed to be for. Tarawa's cost would force that question to a head. The change began more or less simultaneously in 2 separate places. The first was Camp Elliott in San Diego, where the earlier informal school was being systematically reorganized into something considerably more rigorous. The second was Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where Captain Walter Walsh was running a parallel program. Walsh was, by any measure, an unusual figure to find running a wartime marksmanship school. A former FBI agent widely reputed as one of the finest pistol and rifle shots in the entire country, now serving as officer in charge of the Marine Sniper School at Lejeune. The specific conclusion Walsh and his contemporaries reached across 1942 through 1944 was one no other Allied service had yet drawn with equal clarity. The Japanese sniper problem was never fundamentally a marksmanship problem at all. American Marines could already shoot extremely well by any conventional measure. What they had not yet learned to do was the considerably harder discipline that actually mattered most in dense jungle terrain: to think, observe, and remain invisible the way an experienced Japanese sniper already could. The reorganized Marine Scout sniper schools accordingly restructured their curriculum around two parallel tracks rather than one. Marksmanship remained essential, but the larger share of instructional time went to fieldcraft, concealed movement, camouflage construction, range estimation by eye alone, map and compass navigation, sustained observation discipline, and, critically, training built explicitly around two-man teams rather than the lone marksman model most Western armies still assumed. The doctrine that emerged treated the pair, rather than the individual sniper, as the basic tactical unit. One Marine served as shooter, the second as spotter, responsible for locating targets, calling wind corrections, watching continuously for counter-sniper threats, and providing close-range defense if the position was compromised. The two roles were deliberately interchangeable, with both men cross-trained so that fatigue never degraded either function for long. In the specific operational sense that mattered against the enemy they were fighting, the two men functioned as a single, extended set of senses. This mattered enormously against a Japanese sniper who, for all his patience and individual craft, was almost always working entirely alone in his takotsubo, able to scan in only one direction at any given moment. A team could split that same burden, one man watching one elevation and angle, the other watching another, and a spotter frequently noticed disturbed foliage or a telltale muzzle position even in cases where the shooter's own attention was elsewhere. Two sets of trained eyes, working together in sustained silence, could locate a concealed man that either alone consistently could not. The rifle itself was the second piece of the emerging system, and the Marine Corps made the specific decision not to standardize on a single model. The Springfield M1903A1, with its 8-power uninertal scope, despite its documented humidity problems, remained in active service throughout the war and saw genuinely effective use later at Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa, offering Marine teams a real long-range option in the rarer stretches of more open terrain. For close jungle work specifically, Marine units increasingly favored the M1903A4, fitted with the shorter, more rugged 2.5-power Weaver scope, a combination that, according to Marine Corps historical assessment, performed with particular reliability in the dense jungle conditions at Cape Gloucester. The lower magnification suited combat that was almost always fast, almost always close, and almost always conducted in genuinely poor light. There was, the Marines had concluded through hard institutional experience, no single correct rifle for every Pacific engagement. There was only the correct rifle for the specific fight a given team was actually likely to face. What arguably mattered most, though, was doctrine for counter-sniper response at the squad and platoon level. And here the Marine Corps did something genuinely distinctive among Allied forces of the period. Most other armies treated the sniper threat as a problem belonging exclusively to specialists. Marine units, having watched their own officers die to Japanese sharpshooters from the war's opening days, made counter-sniper response part of every ordinary infantryman's job. The technique units developed became known informally as raking the treetops. When a unit entered ground where sniper activity had already been confirmed, designated automatic weapons would systematically sweep the surrounding canopy with sustained fire. Two-man counter-sniper teams held forward defensive positions, while additional pairs climbed jungle trees directly to gain elevation of their own. 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds proved genuinely effective at saturating entire suspected sniper areas with a spread of fragmenting steel. The Browning automatic rifle became the specific weapon of choice for squad-level counter-sniper work. Once a position was reasonably well identified, a Marine with a BAR could deliver more concentrated, precisely directed automatic fire into a suspected hide than either a standard machine gun or a submachine gun typically could. A full 20-round magazine capable of collapsing a confirmed tree position within seconds. And when a position simply could not be located through observation alone, Marines brought forward the M2 flamethrower. Its operator's average field life expectancy ran to roughly 4 minutes, since the visible orange flame reliably drew fire from any remaining concealed positions nearby. But the M2 turned hidden spider holes and takotsubo positions into what amounted to open graves. A Japanese soldier who could survive an extended artillery bombardment inside a properly constructed hide could not survive burning fuel pumped directly into the same confined space. By 1944, Marine units were running this entire sequence in fixed order. A scout sniper team identified a suspected position, a BAR gunner suppressed and confirmed it, a flamethrower team closed under rifle escort, the position was destroyed, and the unit continued its advance. It remained costly. It remained, in the ordinary sense, imperfect. But it worked, and the more consistently it worked, the more Marine units began to believe they were finally outthinking an enemy whose principal advantage had always been unlimited time and patience. One structural weakness remained, though. Even with a genuinely effective counter-sniper system in place, Marine units were still, by definition, reacting. The Japanese sniper fired first, the Marines responded afterward. Solving the problem completely would require going further still, taking the fight directly to Japanese snipers before they ever had the opportunity to pull a trigger at all. It would require going behind their own lines. The man who took that next step was First Lieutenant Frank Tucholsky. According to 40 Thieves on Saipan, written by Tucholsky's son Joseph together with Cynthia Crack, drawing on extensive interviews with the platoon's surviving veterans alongside documentary records held by the National Archives, Tucholsky was a Mustang officer who had risen through the enlisted ranks, a former Pennsylvania steelworker who had already fought at Tarawa. His fitness reports returned repeatedly to the identical single word, rugged. In early 1944, Colonel James Risley of the 6th Marine Regiment selected Tucholsky specifically to organize, train, and command an entirely new kind of unit, the 6th Marine Regiment's own Scout Sniper Platoon, with a mission split explicitly into two distinct halves. The first was conventional, acting as bodyguards for the regimental command post. The second was something considerably more ambitious, scouting and mapping enemy fortifications, inflicting whatever covert damage the platoon could manage, and drawing enemy fire specifically to ease the advance of the regiment's regular line companies. In plainer terms, the platoon existed to operate behind enemy lines. Tucholsky's own recruiting criteria were, by conventional military standards, deliberately unorthodox. When two Marines fought each other, the loser typically ended up in the infirmary and the winner in the brig, and Tucholsky specifically wanted the men who ended up in the brig, on the reasoning that a documented brawling history at least confirmed a man who knew how to handle himself under real physical pressure. He deliberately recruited men whose own fitness reports described them as troublemakers, brawlers, and habitual gamblers. Within the wider 6th Marines, the platoon's practiced skill at improvising its own supply chain through what Marines euphemistically called Marine methods, a polite institutional term for theft, earned them a nickname from their own envious regimental peers that stuck for the rest of the war, the 40 Thieves. Their training regimen emphasized hand-to-hand combat above nearly every other individual skill. Silent killing techniques, jiu-jitsu, knife fighting, bayonet work, all taught under the direct instruction of Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Drexel Biddle, a genuinely celebrated combatives expert of the period. The underlying assumption behind this training was specific and unsentimental. A scout sniper operating deep inside enemy territory might well find himself unable to fire his own rifle at all without immediately revealing his exact position, and would need the ability to kill in complete silence when firing simply was not an option. They sailed for Saipan in May 1944. The Battle of Saipan, beginning June 15, 1944, became the bloodiest American operation of the Pacific War to that date. More than 15,000 Marines killed or wounded, taking an island held by roughly 30,000 Japanese defenders, who would, in overwhelming numbers, choose death over surrender. Terrain across the island varied brutally: sugarcane fields, jungle ravines, cave-pocked coral ridges, and Japanese snipers operated in every distinct environment the island offered. Tucholsky's platoon was committed into all of them, spending days at a stretch operating inside Japanese-held territory, working ahead of the regular line companies to identify enemy positions, map fortifications, and note machine gun and sniper emplacements before the main advance ever reached them. They carried U-Nerdle-scope Springfields for the occasions a shot was genuinely necessary, and knives for the far more frequent occasions when it was not, because on Saipan, firing a weapon at all could mean immediate discovery and death, and the thieves killed in silence whenever the situation genuinely allowed it. But scouting was only half their actual mission. The other half represented something the Pacific War had not, up to that point, really seen at this scale: Marines deliberately hunting Japanese officers in Japanese sniper positions behind the enemy's own lines, eliminating threats before those positions could ever be brought to bear against the advancing line companies coming up behind them. They were doing, in a specific and deliberate sense, precisely what Japanese snipers had already been doing to American patrols for close to 2 years, waiting patiently inside prepared hides, watching known trails, and taking the highest value targets first. The Japanese sniper, the specific figure who had haunted the jungles of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester in the popular Marine imagination, was now, for the first time, finding himself the one being stalked. One specific episode captures the platoon's operating style with particular clarity. Along one ridge on Saipan, the thieves used their universal-scoped Springfields to systematically discourage Japanese troops from descending a specific slope on bicycles. Not a conventional sniper duel in any traditional sense, but a quiet, deliberate, patient erosion of one narrow enemy logistical option, picking off individual riders one at a time from a hide constructed and concealed days in advance, forcing Japanese forces to abandon a route that had genuinely been useful to them. In a separate action, when a Japanese tank approached the regimental command post directly and the platoon had no dedicated anti-tank weapon available, they improvised, destroying the tank with Molotov cocktails assembled from whatever fuel and glass bottles happened to be on hand. This was the new operational identity of the Marine Scout sniper: hunter, saboteur, silent killer, and, with growing frequency, the specific man Japanese forces themselves had genuine reason to fear. The 40 Thieves were not, by mid-1944, a genuinely unique unit within the Marine Corps. They were representative of what Scout sniper platoons across every Marine division had steadily become, having absorbed the specific lessons men like Hawkins, Tuchovsky, and Walsh had spent 2 hard years developing under fire. But the war was not over, and Japan was about to introduce a defensive variation that would test every element of what the Marines had learned all over again. Because on the islands chosen for Japan's final stand, snipers were no longer hiding in trees. They were hiding inside mountains. February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. Marines coming ashore on the island's black volcanic sand were walking into the most concentrated defensive position the Imperial Japanese Army had constructed anywhere in the entire war. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent close to a year personally preparing the island's defenses, and had deliberately broken with conventional Japanese doctrine in the process. There would be no banzai charges on the beaches. No concentrated counterattack meant to throw the invasion back into the sea. Instead, some 21,000 Japanese troops were dug into roughly 11 miles of reinforced concrete tunnel, hundreds of individual pillboxes, and a cave network dense enough that a surface position cleared by Marines in the morning could be silently reoccupied from underneath within hours. Kuribayashi had assigned a full quarter of his entire garrison on standing order to continuous tunneling work, a single command decision that transformed the entire island, in effect, into one continuous fortified sniper hide connected by underground passages no surface reconnaissance could fully map in advance. The snipers waiting on Iwo Jima were not the same category of threat the Marines had originally encountered on Guadalcanal. These men fought from concrete-reinforced cave mouths, frequently visible from the surface only as a narrow firing slit, commanding clear fields of fire across the island's broken volcanic terrain, with nowhere to retreat except deeper still into the mountain itself. This was the Pacific sniper problem in its final, most extreme configuration, and the Marines met it with the complete system 3 years of accumulated combat experience had built. 2-man scout sniper teams moved ahead of the line companies, identifying positions through patient, unmoving observation exactly as doctrine specified. Once a hide was confirmed, the now familiar squad-level response activated in sequence. BAR gunners suppressing, bazooka teams engaging cave mouths directly at ranges small arms fire could not effectively reach, Thompson submachine guns and additional BAR fire suppressing whatever defenders remained inside, and then, as at every major battle since Cape Gloucester, came the flamethrowers, refined by this stage of the war into something considerably more formidable than the man-carried M2. The Marines brought M4 A3 R3 Sherman tanks fitted with a mounted flame projector, nicknamed by the men on the line simply as Zippo tanks. According to the 1st Marine Division's own official history, this specific weapon was the one that reliably caused Japanese defenders to abandon caves and rock crevices and run into the open. A concealed sniper, however skillfully positioned, could not maintain his hide under sustained fire from a Zippo tank, which either killed him directly or forced him into open ground where waiting scout sniper teams and BAR gunners were already positioned. By the time Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, V Amphibious Corps had killed approximately 22,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, the highest single-action loss in the entire history of the Marine Corps, with roughly one Marine or Navy corpsman becoming a casualty for every 3 who had landed on the island. The system, built at enormous and continuing cost, had held even against this most extreme configuration of the same underlying threat. Then came Okinawa. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Marine and Army forces landed against almost no initial opposition at all, prompting Admiral Raymond Spruance to signal Admiral Chester Nimitz, wondering, in the moment, whether Japanese forces had simply abandoned the fight. Nimitz's own reply reportedly instructed him to delete everything in his message after a single word. The Japanese had not, in fact, quit. They had repeated Kuribayashi's Iwo Jima strategy at considerably larger scale, withdrawing from the invasion beaches entirely into the hills and ridgelines of southern Okinawa, where tunnel networks, concealed cave positions, and interconnected trench systems turned nearly every ridge into its own fortress, and nearly every cave mouth into a potential sniper hide. The Marines applied the complete system they had spent 3 years refining: scout-sniper teams identifying positions, BAR gunners suppressing, both man-carried and tank-mounted flamethrowers finishing the reduction. By June 1945, as General Mitsuru Ushijima's defensive line finally collapsed, the doctrine had held at the largest scale it would ever be tested against. What matters most in this account was never really the rifles. It was the thinking behind how they were used. Marine leadership, watching their own officers die steadily through 1942 and 1943, eventually accepted a specific and genuinely uncomfortable conclusion. The problem in front of them could not be solved by simply producing better individual marksmen. The Japanese sniper carried advantages no American training pipeline could realistically match on an individual, man-for-man basis. An entire professional career spent deliberately cultivating patience and invisibility, frequently building on a lifetime of hunting experience that began well before any military training at all. American forces, drawing from a citizen-soldier tradition and compressed wartime training timelines, could not reasonably expect to produce individual snipers as patient as men who had effectively been training since childhood. So instead of attempting to out-Japanese the Japanese sniper on his own individual terms, the Marine Corps built something structurally different: a team-based, combined arms counter-sniper system that never depended on any single Marine matching any single Japanese sniper's individual skill. The two-man team replaced the lone shooter. The BAR replaced the personal duel. The flamethrower replaced patient individual stalking. The scout-sniper platoon, working systematically ahead of the line companies, replaced the isolated hero hunting alone through the jungle. It was, in its own specific way, a genuinely characteristic American solution to the problem. The Japanese sniper doctrine trusted the individual artisan above all else. The Marine counter-sniper doctrine trusted the team. And across the brutal 3-year grind from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the system consistently beat the artisan. The names behind that institutional achievement are, for the most part, unremembered today outside specialist military history circles. Hawkins, killed on the pier at Tarawa, survives in popular memory chiefly because an airstrip carries his name. Tucholsky, who survived Saipan and lived to 96, is remembered mainly because his son eventually wrote a book about him. Walsh, who ran the school at Lejeune, appears in a scattered handful of post-war memoirs. Most of the privates, corporals, and lieutenants who actually built this system through direct trial and error, who paid, in a great many documented cases, with their own lives for lessons that eventually made their way into a post-war training manual, are not remembered at all. But the doctrine they built did not end with the Pacific War. It was applied again in Korea. It was applied in Vietnam, where Marine snipers, including Chuck Mawhinney, recorded more than 100 confirmed kills using techniques tracing directly back to the wartime schools at Camp Elliott and Camp Lejeune. It has been applied in every significant Marine deployment since, from Iraq to Afghanistan, all of it descending through an unbroken institutional line from a specific fight in the steaming jungles of the South Pacific, against an enemy so unfamiliar in 1942 that veterans of an entirely different war, fought a generation earlier on the Western Front, initially refused to believe what their own men were reporting back to them. The modern Marine Scout Sniper Corps still traces its own doctrinal lineage directly to this period. The two-man team, the deliberate integration with supporting weapons rather than reliance on the rifle in isolation, the specific insistence that observation and patience be graded and tested with the same rigor as a rifle qualification score, all of it inherited, largely unchanged in its underlying logic, from lessons first paid for in the mud outside Cape Gloucester. The young Marine wading through the Cape Gloucester swamp in late 1943, watching his friend drop to a sniper he never saw and never located, had no way of knowing any of this. The system that would eventually answer for that specific death was still being built around him, piece by piece, in real time. The men constructing it, Hawkins chief among them, were, at that exact moment, still alive. The blood required to pay for each individual lesson was still being spent. That the lessons themselves were, however slowly and however expensively, already being learned. By 1945, the schools at Camp Elliott and Camp Lejeune were producing Marines capable of finding and killing a Japanese sniper inside his own concealed position before he ever had the chance to fire. By the time the Pacific War ended, the United States Marine Corps had accomplished something no other Allied army in the theater had managed across the entire conflict. It had taken the single most feared individual killer in the Pacific and turned him, systematically and permanently, into a hunted man.